friend of mine recently made a LinkedIn post when she talked about DMRV fails, which is to say, when you use remote sensing or DMRV and then something goes wrong with the map and you're kind of interpreting the wrong thing from the map, you're getting the wrong conclusion. We shouldn't necessarily trust everything at face value given how many different providers there are and all the different things they're trying to do. Let me start with maybe some asterisks on this video here. The first point that I would make is DMRV is incredibly important for all types of carbon projects. It is very important that we use satellite data to monitor the sourcing of biochar and wood burial. It's important to monitor for cook stoves, whether deforestation is really decreasing around the region because they're using less wood. If you're building wind turbines, you probably want to know if wind turbines are being built as the normal state of affairs in the region without the carbon credits. But of course, when we talk about DMRV, we usually talk about nature-based stuff, like planting trees, maybe some ag stuff. Their DMRV is critical to figuring out carbon stock accurately, baselines, so finding other places and seeing what they're doing, leakage rates, and how much deforestation might be happening inside of these projects. So let me then go on to the next asterisk here, which is that remote sensing is capable of almost everything you need it to do. So you can measure carbon very accurately with remote sensing. You can monitor for deforestation very accurately. You can even get things like nutrient content and forest health very accurately. The problem is that when you're trying to do those complex things, generally you need to use better data. You need to use data that's expensive. And so the failures tend to happen in DMRV when companies try to do too much with too little. And a lot of companies right now are trying to use just kind of free data from satellites. The third point that I would make before we get into this is that the carbon market historically has been very skeptical and unfriendly of remote sensing as a tool. And this has been very harmful to the carbon markets because it is extremely difficult to get projects onboarded. It means that instead of relying on pure, cold, and true satellite imagery, you're relying on things like storytelling and models that we don't necessarily trust as much. And so as a result, because Vera and others have been skeptical of satellite data or DMRV, we see kind of a lower quality of carbon project. We see fewer carbon projects than we'd like to see, and the carbon projects that do happen are gigantic. So remote sensing is really important for the carbon markets, but it's been kind of as a side thought. And one commonality that I see in the carbon markets is that when they do accept remote sensing, they'll often put impossible stipulations on it. So they'll say, oh, you can have remote sensing, but you have to have hundreds of plots inside the project to validate the model. That is pointless. There's no point in having remote sensing, as a tool here if you have to take measurements inside the project itself, because then why even bother with the remote sensing? You're already just taking measurements by hand. So those are my 3 big points. But nevertheless, we see a lot of problems with remote sensing products. And to start with, I think the best thing to do is to talk about different types of sensors. People often wonder why my videos used to be 10 minutes and now they're 45 minutes. Well, I think we need to kind of give a background on the different ways in which you can measure forests with remote sensing. So it's a spectrum, really, of kind of quality of remote sensing instruments. And at the far end, the highest quality of remote sensing is maybe terrestrial laser scanning, or super high quality estimates of where you take a laser and you measure every single tree and you can model it in 3D and you can actually measure the actual volume of the trees and stuff. That is very expensive. It requires you to tromp around in the field with a backpack or some really high-tech gadgetry and stuff. Even just processing that data is very expensive because these are 10,000 point per meter point clouds and stuff. It's kind of crazy and excessive, and generally we don't see too many people wanting to pay for it. Kind of towards the middle of the spectrum is instruments and data that can be collected from the air, but isn't as intensive. So drone-based LiDAR, drone-based photogrammetry, these are things that are still a bit intense, but you still maybe have to drive to the site with a drone, but it's definitely not the same as having to do pattern, walking in lines through the woods. Aerial acquisitions from aircraft is a really good approach. It's kind of a middle ground between quality and price point. You can fly LiDAR from an aircraft at, thousands of feet and cover a lot of ground and get very good estimates of carbon. And we do know that aerial LiDAR acquisitions or photogrammetry acquisitions can get you carbon estimates that are on par or better than field inventories. There's been decades of very solid science that demonstrates that that's the case. But then, towards kind of the lower price point end of the spectrum, we have spaceborne instruments. And there's a lot of different sensors in space. So let's walk through the top 4 that we see being used. The most common type of spaceborne satellite instrument is imaging satellites. So these obviously do take a picture of the Earth, maybe every day, maybe every month, and essentially they measure greenness. Now they do measure a bunch of infrared bands as well to tell you what the infrared reflectance is off of a tree. And looking at the absorption of red light versus infrared light, you can often tell pretty accurately how much photosynthesis is taking place in a forest. But photosynthesis is not the same as carbon. The problem there is that photosynthesis, it tells you how much is going on, at one given time, but it doesn't tell you how much carbon is being stored by a tree. And one of the bigger problems with imaging satellites is that the correlation between photosynthesis and carbon, it kind of gets weaker the older the forest is, because you have forests that have full grown tree crowns and they don't change much from one year to the next, and they continue to accrue carbon every year. And you can't really tell from the satellite based on what's going on in the canopy, how big the tree is. Is it a 60-year-old tree? Is it an 80-year-old tree? This is hard to tell. The next type of satellite that we have are radar satellites. Now, radar satellites obviously work by shooting radio waves out and bouncing off the ground, and usually the strength of the return is what we look at in terms of what's there on the ground. Longer wavelengths tend to penetrate deeper into the forest. And so they tend to actually tell us more about the carbon stock, because the deeper you go, the taller the trees are, obviously, and then you can kind of infer based on the height of the trees, maybe, how much carbon there is. Shorter wavelengths tend to just bounce right off the surface. So short wavelength satellites are still very good at telling you whether or not there's been deforestation or if there's been a change or something, but they don't tell you much about the carbon, because if the trees are 15 meters or 30 meters, it just bounces right off either way. So the thing is, most satellites in orbit right now are short wavelength radar satellites. So we don't really have too many long wavelength satellites. There are 2 that are coming online later this year, so that is very exciting in terms of a DMRV context. There's another one that's been floating around out there, but is kind of harder to work with. So essentially most people are using just the short wavelength ones that just kind of bounce right off the surface. The next category of spaceborne data that I would bring up is very high resolution imagery. Now, this is the kind of imagery that you see, Donald Trump leaking or whatever, where it's 1 meter resolution or better, and you can really see not only how green the trees are, but you can also see the width of the tree crowns. And if you know the width of the tree crowns, then you're really getting more closer to figuring out how much carbon there is, because that obviously corresponds to how big the trees are. The thing is that 1 meter resolution imagery from space is extremely expensive. So nobody's really using it. All the DMRV providers that I've seen, they either use 10 meter stuff. I think Planet uses 4 meter stuff, but it's not, nobody's really getting down to that point in which they can measure the tree crowns. So it exists out there, but it's just too expensive, and it's similar to LiDAR in that we kind of know it works, but people aren't really adopting it too much. And then finally, what we have is spaceborne LiDAR. This is very different than the type of LiDAR that we get from the ground, because spaceborne LiDAR operates in such a way that the machine just shoots out a laser beam. It goes down, hits the forest, and then comes back. And so you just get a single point measurement of tree height. And the thing about these LiDAR data from space, JEDI is the tool that mostly provides this. It's very sparse. So you'll get maybe one hit, and then there'll be a couple hundred meters, and maybe you get another hit. So it doesn't map out wall-to-wall forest carbon. And these measurements also come with a decent amount of error. So those are generally the offerings from space. And when you're looking at DMRV providers who are trying to map carbon stock across the entire planet, these are the data sets that they're working with. And like I said, I think all of them except for Planet Labs is using the free data. So they're all basically taking the same ingredients and putting it into the soup. There's a couple of fundamental challenges to working with spaceborne data. One of them is that no matter which type of data set you're working with, the amount of noise that you get from like one image to the next, radar, Jedi, whatever it is, generally tends to exceed the actual signal. So like it's very easy to envision you getting like a 10% difference between two different images in greenness from a satellite of a forest, but that doesn't actually correspond to like 10% difference in carbon stock. It probably just corresponds to like haze. The other big thing that I pointed out before is that as trees grow, they add more wood. They get wider and wider. Their trunks get wider, but a lot of the time their canopy doesn't change much or is very subtle in the changes that it undergoes. And so mature forests, whether or not the trees are like big enough to drive a car through or like, this big around, they tend to look very similar from satellites. Okay, so we covered some of the actual technologies. Now let's talk about the actual problems that take place. And I want to start with a problem that I'm going to generally bin as improper normalization between different images. Now, the thing is that when a DMRV provider is making a map, they're taking a bunch of different satellite images and sticking them together. So they're taking images from like last year and images from like this year, and they're kind of sticking them all together in different ways. The problem is, every time you take a picture of the Earth, conditions vary a lot. So the atmospheric haziness, for example, will really impact greenness. And we all know this already, because if we can imagine like looking across a big field and looking at like trees in the horizon, on some days those trees will be like crystal clear green, and on other days it'll be kind of a bluish hue. And that's haze. Some of it's pollution, some of it's ozone, some of it's water. The same thing happens from a satellite, and it's really very difficult to then measure the greenness of the tree on different dates. Clouds can be a real big trouble too. It is, you can just kind of mask out where there are clouds and avoid like looking at images with clouds. But clouds don't really have a definitive start and end, and they kind of get wispy, and it's hard to see whether or not a pixel is affected by a cloud or not. One of the bigger issues that also exists with looking at forests from space is that forests themselves are not static. There's always a seasonal flux. So forests always operate on a cycle where they kind of reach the greenest point either during the warm season or during the wet season, and then kind of decline for the dry, cold season, and then kind of go up again next year. So they operate on kind of year-long cycles. The thing is, if you're combining images, and one's from June and one's from September, the greenness that you observe is going to be different just because they're at different points in their cycle. So people put a lot of effort into trying to account for all these things and then hammer these trends out of images. Even in like tropical environments where like the trees don't lose their leaves, right? Like there is still always a greenness cycle that can be observed from a satellite. So maybe let me touch on like one of the only real world examples that I'm going to show here, which is the height map released by Meta. If you zoom into like anywhere on Earth, you can see really big differences in tree height between these different strips. Now, what these strips represent are different images that have been stitched together, and the different images probably had different atmospheric conditions from one day to the next. The problem with this map is you can see the trees are like 15 meters here and like 30 meters there, and that's not a real thing that's actually happening on the ground. So it was kind of improper normalization when like stitching these images together and then feeding them into the model. And this can happen if you don't put enough like kind of pre-processing into your pipeline and you just kind of dump raw imagery into a deep learning model. So let me take an aside and ask, like, is there harm in releasing a map like this? And I would argue that there potentially is. People can take this map and then use it for analytics that are incorrect. So you could imagine someone pointing to an area where the trees are super tall and saying like, oh, there's tons of carbon there. That's really just a problem with the atmospheric correction, not the actual height of the trees. Or you could imagine people pointing to like areas where the trees are really short and saying like, here's a baseline that says the trees are all going to die. So I do think that there is like actual social risk to releasing maps that have like large amounts of issues with them. What do you actually look for when you're looking at a map like this? Well, some things to look for are maybe like bizarre inconsistencies that kind of represent changes between one image to another. So visible lines in which it kind of looks like, oh, there's a scene from a satellite here and one from there. losses that happen but don't happen along roads. So like these are like strips here, and it's not like actually following a road because people deforest along roads. Losses that happen all at once. So when you just see the forest declining in carbon stock by like 15 tons in a single year across the entire landscape, that's not how deforestation works, right? Losses that happen along straight lines or ribbons. I think one very common thing you'll see on some maps are kind of scan lines, where they almost look like lines of static, where like the estimate will be different in these kind of horizontal strips or like diagonal strips. That is oftentimes an artifact of certain Landsat-derived products. And just instances in which like you see trends on the map that look more like they might be driven by seasonality. So if you see kind of blobs of trees like declining in biomass, but it looks like those trees are maybe the more deciduous types. That might have more to do with the trees losing their leaves and like an image with the leaves being included one year and not the next. Than it would necessarily with like actual trends. So when you see, the other thing I would point out is that when you see biomass jumps up and down year to year, when you've got a map that you're applying over the last 10 years and it goes, ooh, 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 that's not how it actually works in the forest, right? It doesn't like decrease by 15% and then go up by 15%. So that's not generally something that you like to see with remote sensing maps. One of the issues is that many time series models that are trying to estimate carbon stock over many years, they do so by fitting a line through long-term trends. So you dump in like 100 images from the last 10 years and you fit a line through them, right? The problem is that sometimes lines will be fit that don't represent like actual observations, and sometimes just random chance will lead you to observing a trend that doesn't really exist. So I'll give you an example. If in the last 2 years out of the 10, it just happened to be really cloudy on like the 2 wettest seasons of the month, and there weren't any images, then the images that were captured in the last 2 years would only look at the dry season. And then that could mean that the greenness decreases in those last 2 years. It doesn't actually have anything to do with carbon stock, but because this model is based on greenness and photosynthesis and stuff, it'll look like there's been a decline in carbon stock when there hasn't been. It's like deforestation usually happens like boom, or degradation, it's like 1/3 loss in like a single year. Another, I will say one of the big challenges to working with space-based data is that the fluctuations from any given like image like tend to outpace the signal. Like if you're trying to observe growth, this is particularly problematic because like, okay, trees maybe add like 5 tons per hectare per year, but they're swinging, but like the images themselves may swing by like, 20% or something. So it's like really difficult to measure growth in a forest with satellite-based stuff. If you have LiDAR, repeat LiDAR acquisitions, okay, but the satellite-based stuff is problematic. The next problem that I want to mention is called saturation. And what I mean by this is, like I said, as a forest matures, the canopy kind of fills out. And then eventually it gets to the point where the forest is old enough that like some trees start to die and you get gaps and stuff. But it does hit a point where all old forests kind of look the same. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. But like essentially like the trees will continue to grow wider and wider in their trunks, but their canopies, they start to look very similar to themselves. So it tends to be the case that a lot of models underpredict how much carbon there is in high carbon areas because they kind of hit this point at which they saturate, and then they kind of predict the same thing everywhere. What does this actually look like on a map? Well, if you look at a 1-to-1 curve of like model predictions and results, what you'll often see is kind of a trailing off where like it's making predictions, but the actual observed data has more carbon than that. So that's what it looks like on a 1-to-1 plot for like the stats. But on a map, what it often looks like is in areas where the trees are huge, it'll kind of underpredict how much carbon there is. Another problem that's pretty closely related is overgeneralization. And this can occur when an AI model is faced with a lot of noise, and it tends to just kind of then predict the same value wherever there's forests, because that's the safest. The model just kind of thinks to itself in the nonsensical way that they think. Oh, well, most forests are 150 tons. Let me predict 150 tons rather than predicting 250 tons and probably being wrong. And so everywhere that there's forest, you'll see just the same flat number. And this is quite common, I would say. Real forests vary a lot in carbon density. Very slight differences in microsite and elevation and water access can lead to really dramatic differences in carbon stock. But oftentimes you don't see that from these kind of remote sensing satellite models. One of the things that you need to kind of look for is whether or not the model also then estimates like too much carbon in low carbon areas. And this can be very risky if you're trying to create carbon credits with an overgeneralized model, because anywhere that is like the forests are really small, it'll overpredict. And sometimes it'll even overpredict where there isn't forest at all, because it just likes predicting down the middle. These maps can look very good, right? They look very compelling because like you get a very clean image of a forest. Here's trees, here's no trees. But in reality, like nature is messy, and you would expect to see like pretty big differences in carbon stock in any given part of the forest. The next problem that I want to talk about is a little different, and this is a problem of training data. The thing is, AI models require tons and tons of data to train on. And in this case, training data means field plots. It means that somebody has to go out there and measure these trees by hand. The problem is that nobody really wants to do this. Field measurements are very expensive. They're very hard to come by. Most of these big DMRV providers are not tromping around in the Papua New Guinean forest with a tape measure so that they can validate their models. That's actually pretty uncommon because it's very expensive to do that. So they rely on scientists who have done this for other like scientific work. The result is that most training data for global models is opportunistic. It's taken from scientists on ecological reserves that have a grant to like spend a bunch of money measuring this stuff. And so they're not necessarily representative of the landscape. If you're trying to map Costa Rica, the only places that you're going to find are like the 2 ecological reserves where like scientists are allowed to measure trees. And so as a result, I mean, a lot of these models are not trained off of data that is like all that representative of the forest. And the thing is, training data in particular is found mostly in developed nations. If you work for a university and you're going to do a study about a forest, you're going to do it within like a 3-hour drive. You're not going to do it in Indonesia, probably. So the vast majority of training data is in the United States, Canada, EU, that kind of thing. And so the models tend to work better in those places. And in a lot of the time, like we have like very little data in Southeast Asia. And that is the case for everybody. That's the case for everyone offering DMRV options in Southeast Asia. One of the bigger problems is that ecosystems vary enormously. So people really think, I've got 1,000 plots. But like if your 1,000 plots do not correspond to this exact forest type, you're going to have a hard time. It is not enough to just say like we've got a bunch of plots in the Brazilian Amazon and then Gabon released its forest inventory, so we've got plots there, so therefore we can make estimates of the Congo. You're not going to have a good time there. The trees are very different. I think that everyone's oftentimes trying to train off of the same data sets, and those data sets are very sparse, especially in places where like there's not a lot of funding for science. One of the other problems that I'm starting to see out there is that a lot of people are training models off of other people's maps. So they take you're a startup, you've hired some AI whiz or whatever. You don't have the money to actually tromp around in the woods. You're going to train off of some other scientist's map to make estimates for your spaceborne model. This is very, very dangerous because that other person's map has some unknown amount of error. You're not actually able to validate how accurate your map is. And errors just kind of accumulate the whole way. A lot of self-driving car companies train their self-driving car models on video games like Grand Theft Auto 5. You would not want to step into a self-driving car that was just trained on Grand Theft Auto 5. You would want to step into a car that was trained on like real hard data that took a long time to collect. What do you look for in this? I mean, it is hard to tell because these models will make predictions everywhere, but like ask for the training data, ask to see where the plots are, and then figure out whether or not the plots are like representative of the area you're trying to make a prediction in. The next problem is actually kind of similar, which is young trees. The problem is the majority of training data worldwide is collected either in reserves or by countries that are measuring their forest. and they do not include young trees, and they usually don't include degraded forests. So the models will make predictions in places where you have young trees or degraded forests, but they are often very bad because they've seen very little actual, like, real data to say what's going on in those places. One of the big problems is that satellites often confuse young trees with shrubs, or the other way around. They usually confuse shrubs with young trees. And, from space, like a blackberry bush that's taking over a reforestation site looks pretty similar to a tree that's, 3 years old. So it may look as if from space your reforestation is enormously successful, but it's all just a bunch of blackberry bushes. I think, the other big problem that we see is that young forests that are planted for reforestation projects, they're planted in nice, neat rows, and they're planted densely so that they can kind of close their canopy quickly without things competing with them. This causes a real problem because these models are not trained on nicely densely planted rows. And so even though you might be planting native trees, the model is going to usually confuse this forest for being much older than it actually is, because a planted forest will close its canopy a lot faster than a natural regeneration site. And so as a result, people will often make estimates of reforestation sites in which they leap up in carbon stock a lot sooner than they should. So you'll see nothing, 150 tons, which is very impossible. You'll see this because of overgeneralization, where it's all of a sudden the model switches and thinks, oh, okay, now it's forest. Let me assign it the average forest number. So that's what you want to look out for, is if your remote sensing model is predicting overly fast growth in a young forest. The next problem that I want to talk about is greening. And this is one that doesn't get much play in the DMRV space, but the reality is that the Earth is getting greener. And that's because we're dumping a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, and CO2 is actually, to some extent, useful for enabling trees to grow faster with less water. So trees are getting greener, and we know that there's been an increase over the last 30 or 40 years. This is a well-observed phenomenon. That does not correspond to carbon. And the problem is that you may observe a 10% increase in greenness over the last 30 years, but that does not mean that the forest has been able to pull out 10% more carbon. Usually the carbon accumulation is much slower than the greening response. And so you can observe more photosynthesis may be taking place, but it is not the same as carbon. And so models don't really know how to handle this, because you're usually training them on a field plot that was taken at a fixed point in time, and they just see the forest getting greener, and so they say then that forests are accumulating carbon when they're not. So what you want to look for here is if over the course of time untouched forests seem to be growing too quickly. And I think people are often overly optimistic about how much carbon old growth can remove. This is a compounding social problem. Old growth forests are pretty close to a steady state system. They can remove some carbon. They are removing some, but they are not removing as much as your DMRV model might be saying. So keep an eye out for that. The last problem that I want to talk about is uncertainty in general. Many map providers in the DMRV space are not sharing rigorous data on their models' accuracies. Or frankly, they hide it behind scientific mumbo jumbo. Now some do. I'm particularly happy with Planet Labs, because they've not only published papers, peer-reviewed papers, but they also tend to have a very good internal reporting system of how their maps actually work. But other DMRV providers are completely secret about how they actually do their uncertainty estimates. Many don't account for things like spatial autocorrelation of nearby pixels, and so they end up underestimating error. To get into this really quickly, one of the problems that you have with DMRV maps is that when you have a whole bunch of pixels in an area, in a carbon project, the errors will all tend to be correlated. And so you'll end up getting more error inside that project area than you'd expect if you looked at the entire map. And so, they tend to kind of underestimate how much actual error there is. And then, one of the things you always want to ask for is pixel level RMSE as a percent of mean and total. Bias, and that refers to how wrong systematically the map is. Spatial autocorrelation, how they're actually dealing for that if they are. And you're looking for incredible amounts of transparency and self-deprecation. So what do you want to look for with the DMRV provider in terms of uncertainties? Well, if you're not able to dig into the hard stats, Every respectable remote sensing scientist hates themselves and their model outputs. And this is always something you want to keep in mind when you're talking to remote sensing scientists.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again.
Because without a doubt, the more self-deprecating they are about their data, the better their maps are. I'm not even, like, okay, I am joking, but, like, I'm not really even joking. Like, if you're approaching a DMRV provider who comes at this with too much grandeur, too much bragging about, like, how this map is going to work everywhere and stuff, that is a major red flag. They should be outlining for you all the ways in which this map is good for some things and bad for others. So let's then talk about solutions. So what can we do in the space still with satellite data or with these DMRV maps that people are providing? Well, global maps are very good at large scales. So, if you're talking about estimating deforestation within an entire country, this is great. And, in a jurisdictional context, I think that these providers are doing a really, really good work. It's when you're getting into like these little like 10,000 hectare projects that like the errors really start to add up. One of the big issues is that you shouldn't necessarily be looking for subtle changes. You shouldn't necessarily be looking for like tiny amounts of biomass growth year over year. Instead, try to categorize the forest into bins. Try to say whether or not, okay, forest has been deforested, it's been partially deforested, or not touched. Those are 3 bins that are much easier to predict than for a model to say that it went from 325 tons to 331 tons. That's a really problematic thing to try to do when your satellite imagery is bouncing around. The next tip that I would have is train local models and use local field data. So even if you're taking like models from a DMRV provider, try to retrain it for like your specific circumstance, and you will get much better results that way. The next point I would make is pay for better data. I know we don't like doing it, but like every once in a while there should be some sort of like higher quality like data set that's required. This is why like the methodology that Renoster created requires a LiDAR shot every once in a while. Like pay for LiDAR, pay for drone data, even if it's just like every 5 or 10 years, just to like have it as a post, here is what we actually observe with good data, and the satellite data kind of fills in the rest. The next point that I would make is that many of the issues that I talked about, in particular satellite normalization, many of these issues can be solved by hammering the data into place. So if you have images from like different dates, you can try to model how the greenness fluxes each year, and then try to hammer that data into place so that images from different dates have the same values. This is how a lot of algorithms like CCDC work for image processing. Invariant pixel normalization is one way of doing this, where you take pixels that haven't changed between 2 images, and then say, okay, well, the pixels that haven't changed have 10% different greenness, therefore let me bump up the greenness in that image. So this is a good way of doing it. It can be risky because you could be hammering out real things. So the more you hammer it, the more you potentially throw out actual observation. The next point that I would make is use heuristics, like use human intuition. The forest can't grow faster than this. We wouldn't expect this forest to accumulate that much carbon. Forest harvesting must be this close to a road. And you can actually do this algorithmically. You can say, like, no forest should ever accumulate more than 3 tons per hectare per year in this environment. So you can put these caps on these models, and they'll just perform better if you put these limits on them. And then finally, I would say, let's not throw out all DMRV data because they have issues. But let's use lower quality data for alerts and then higher quality data for actual detail. Like, let's say I have a carbon project and I want to measure carbon. Every 5 or 10 years, refly LiDAR. But then in between those dates, maybe it is okay to use satellite data. So, lower kind of these spaceborne estimates can be very good at telling you like whether or not something's happening at any given time. They can be very good at deforestation detection. But, if push comes to shove and you're trying to measure something very subtle like carbon change, maybe you still want to tie it down to some truth. And there's statistical ways of doing this. I mean, I don't want to get into it too much, but like if you think about it in like a Bayesian context, if you have a LiDAR shot that's a really good prior for estimating carbon the next year using like lower quality satellite data. So that is to say that there is a lot of value in these products, but we do need to learn their limitations and see when a map is bullshitting us. Like visually, let's look at the patterns and try to figure out if that's the case.